I'm very surprised he entrusted me with that. I'm very good at breaking technology. I must confess, I feel that I'm here somewhat under false pretences. I have no pretension at all to being a historian of industrial relations, but the reality is in Australia almost every historian of industrial relations is so far to the left that they would not be perhaps made as welcome in this room today as they might like, and they certainly wouldn't accept an invitation to come, I don't think. They write articles in their journals called The Great Strike of 1917, How Should We Have Won? And meaning, so you can tell from even just the title of their articles which side they're starting on. So in that sense, I'm perhaps as independent an observer and know as much about it as anyone who's not already made up their minds on the issue. I decided fairly quickly to focus this talk on the Harvester case, and this was both because it was the most important case in the development of Australia's unique industrial relations system, and also because I have a family connection with the case, and there are some family stories that I think give some interesting insights into the case. The Harvester case of 1907, for those who haven't heard of it, determined basically that Australia should have a minimum wage set not by market forces but by the needs of workers and their families. The judgment said that the minimum wage should be sufficient to support a man, his wife and 3 children in conditions of frugal comfort. The uncoupling of wage fixing from the laws of supply and demand, or even from a general assessment of economic conditions, was a dramatic step at the time, and it still resonates in Australian public policy debate today. The issue of fairness in wage setting is a continual topic every time the likes of Work Choices or the Fair Work Act or so on. I mean, even the name of the Fair Work Act really says it all. So how did the Harvester debate, how did the Harvester decision come about, and how does it tie into my family history? Well, to answer this, we'll take you away from Fremantle and back to Northern Ireland in 1851. 2 families, the Shaws and the Mackays, who'd both come from Scotland in the early 17th century as part of the plantation, so they were Protestants, not Catholics. And in 1851, they both decided to sell their family farms and migrate to Australia. I'd always assumed that they'd come out because of the gold rushes. The discovery of gold in Victoria was in the middle of 1851. And as soon as news of that reached the United Kingdom, of course, thousands of people started leaving for Australia. But it turned out they actually left before news arrived in Northern Ireland, so either they had great premonition or else it was just luck. But anyway, they arrived in Melbourne in January 1852, and this was an unbelievably good time to arrive in Victoria. Victoria in the 1850s, and indeed right up until the early 1890s, was the richest place in the world. I think we often forget that in Australia, but really Victoria in particular, and the rest of Australia shared the wealth, was very much the Saudi Arabia, or perhaps more accurately the Norway of the late 19th century. Gold mining made Victoria enormously wealthy. On a per capita basis, I don't think there's any doubt Victoria was the richest place in the world. And it was a great place to be a worker because labour was scarce, so wages were high and unemployment low. And workers could pretty much pick and choose where and when they worked and almost name their wages. The Shaw family did very well in Melbourne, in Victoria. George Shaw, who was my great-grandfather, in that photo there, he's the distinguished-looking chap standing proudly in the middle of his large family. He went, first of all, mining up at Ballarat, but very quickly decided that rather than digging the dirt, he'd sell the shovel, as the saying goes. And so he gave up mining for retailing. He bought cheap in Melbourne and sold deer in Ballarat and Bendigo up in the goldfields. He soon opened a big wine and spirits shop in Melbourne, and business flourished and he became a very wealthy man. The Mackays, on the other hand, stayed mining for longer, but they never really struck it rich. And in the 1860s, they settled on a farm in central Victoria, a place called Raywood, which will come into the story a little bit later on. The Shaw and the Mackay family stayed very close, in 1869, George Shaw married Eliza Mackay. That's Eliza sitting down there. They built a very large house in East Melbourne. It's actually just round the corner from the house of our keynote speaker. Unfortunately, it was knocked down in the 1970s, but it was a mansion by the standards of the time. And they raised their family of 11 children. Eliza's brother Nathaniel and his wife Mary had 12 children, went one better, in their little farmhouse near Bendigo. And the fifth of these children was named Hugh Victor Mackay, more commonly known by his initials HV. Like JJ, it has a certain ring to it. Hugh Victor was born in 1865. Whereas his Shaw cousins were all educated at private schools in Melbourne, one of the very few records I've got and am likely to keep is a record for the greatest number of great uncles ever to have gone to Scotch College. And if you count the 7 there, and then you add more on my father's side, and some on my mother's side, I think I had 13 great uncles who went to the same school, which is not a record likely to be broken, I don't think. Anyway, in contrast to the Shaws, who all educated at private schools and then went on to become doctors or lawyers, or the ones who didn't make it in law or medicine, their father brought them big Western District properties. In contrast to that, HV left school at the age of 13 to work on the family farm. Now, in the 1870s and 1880s, as we heard in the last talk, the wheat industry around Australia and in Victoria in particular was growing very rapidly. And farm labour was expensive and in short supply. So there were strong economic incentives to mechanised farming processes, and in particular to develop a mechanical harvester. And the government was actually offering prizes for mechanical harvesters just to encourage a bit of individual enterprise. In 1884, at the age of 18, H.V. Mackay built a harvester using bits and pieces lying around the family farm. And that's what the first harvester looked like. A rather prettier version probably than the first one. This is one that's in the Museum of Victoria. But he just used bits and pieces lying around the family farm and sort of knocked it up in a shed. There's still some controversy as to whether this was the first genuine combine harvester or not, but of course in our family we have no doubt at all. It was certainly the best marketed one. It worked very well, and Mackay patented it and set up a factory, and that was his first factory. Now, the factory would have been a whole lot bigger except for John Hyde's grandfather. Now, I heard this story at morning tea this morning. By rather remarkable coincidence, John Hyde's grandfather was also a farmer in Raywood, just north of Bendigo in central Victoria, and apparently HV approached him to see if he'd finance building harvesters for sale, and John Hyde's grandfather said, no, dreadful idea, no, go away. And consequently, HV started on a very small scale and without the Hyde finance to support him. Now, this could have had a dramatic influence on Australian history if you think about it. If you think of John Hyde's influence on Australian public policy in the 1970s and 1980s, if his grandfather had gone into manufacturing in a big way, would he have been so keen on dismantling tariffs? so change the course of Australian history. So we'd still have massive big harvester factory producing probably massively inefficient and costly harvesters. But anyway, we don't. H.V. Mackay's business did very, very well in the late 1880s, and he was selling harvesters all around Victoria. But in the crash of the early 1890s, his business went under, as did thousands of other businesses all around Australia. He wasn't alone. The popular saying, of course, is if you didn't go broke in the 1890s, you weren't there. It was later applied, of course, to the 1960s in somewhat different circumstances. But anyway, Mackay restructured his business, the economy recovered, and his sales just went through the roof. He sold 12 harvesters in 1895, 50 in 1896, 500 in 1901, and 2,000 in 1906. As early as 1901, he began exporting harvesters to South Africa, Argentina, and other countries. Recently, I read an article that had been submitted for publication in a journal, and I was asked to review it, and it was essentially the diary of a salesman who was travelling around Argentina selling H.V. Mackay's harvesters, sort of 1904, 1905. Absolutely amazing story. A chap from Melbourne, just, his boss says, you're off to Argentina to sell harvesters. So off he goes. I wonder how many Australian salesmen there are in Argentina selling anything these days. But apparently there were quite a few of them in that period, and Argentina was the biggest export market until the First World War. Mackay even made a sales trip to Russia, and quite remarkably there's a photograph surviving of that. That's him meeting with members of the Russian Agricultural Society in 1912. I'm not sure how many harvesters he sold to Russia, but of course with the First World War coming, the trade would have ended anyway. By mid-1904, he was Australia's largest exporter of manufactured goods. In real terms, his overseas sales were probably far greater than any contemporary Australian manufacturer. I mean, I'm just trying to think of Australian manufacturers who still export: Cochlear, CSL, and the list sort of runs out pretty quickly after that. His business in 1904 employed 500 workers, and by the First World War it was close to 3,000. It was highly profitable, and he became a very wealthy man. He installed modern plant and equipment, developed assembly line processes, and ran a business that was highly efficient by world standards. Nonetheless, competition from North American companies like International Harvester and Canada's Massey Harris was fierce. And Mackay, along with almost every other Australian manufacturer, argued strongly for high tariff protection for his industry. And he was normally given what he asked for. These days, big businesses generate a vast amount of legal work dealing mainly with government regulations, but also mergers, acquisitions, etc., etc. Big companies have vast teams of in-house counsel. They give enormous amount of work to the big law firms. Mackay's legal work was done by his cousin, all of it, who was, if we go back, how do I go back on this? Does that work? Yes. If we go back here, this one here, George Shaw Jr., he did law, and then he graduated in the middle of the dark days of the Depression of the 1890s, then set up as a lawyer and did very well, built up a thriving practice, and H.V. Mackay, his cousin, was his most important client, and naturally enough, industrial law was the main area of his practice. Now, H.V. Mackay had very strong views, not uncommon in a major industrialist, on industrial relations and wage fixing. He disliked trade unions and tried very hard to keep them out of his factories. He believed that market forces should determine wage levels, and at the factory level he believed in individual bargaining between employer and worker. He was strongly opposed to wages being set by tribunals or arbitration. And in 1904 he even moved his factory from Ballarat to the outer western suburbs of Melbourne, to a suburb later called Sunshine, after obtaining secret undertakings from the Victorian government that the jurisdiction of wages boards and other industrial tribunals would not be extended to his new factory. Nonetheless, he still paid his workers slightly above the average for the time. In 1906 he was paying his unskilled workers 6 shillings a day. That's 60 cents, for those of you who don't remember pounds, shillings and pence, 60 cents a day, while the average in Victoria at that time was 5 shillings and sixpence, 55 cents a day. Mind you, the cost of living was slightly lower. Just go through. Oh, sorry, I should have shown you this one. That's a photo of H.V. Mackay, taken in about 1913. You can see his rugged individualism and determination in his face. And that's his factory. It's a little bit hard probably to see from the back, but absolutely massive. Certainly by the standards of the day, it was the biggest factory in Victoria by a considerable margin, and probably in Australia. At least until the BHP steelworks were built in Newcastle. Now, moving the story along, in 1903 Alfred Deakin became Prime Minister. We've talked quite a bit about Alfred Deakin today. He was a quite extraordinary chap, brilliant, slightly deranged, ended up going quite mad. one of the things I find most endearing about him is even while he was Prime Minister, he wrote a regular column in an English journal commenting on Australian politics. It was anonymous, and he frequently criticised his own actions in quite strong terms, referring to that fool deacon and his crackpot ideas. But his name is, as you've heard, most closely associated with the theme of today's conference through what's called the Deaconite Settlement, the White Australia policy, protection of Australian industry, and a centralised framework for arbitration of industrial disputes. A central part of Deacon's policy was what he called the new protection. This was to distinguish it from the old protection. The old protection was just simply putting up tariffs to protect industries from overseas competition. The new protection was a means that Deakin thought he'd worked out to spread the benefits, as he saw them, of tariff protection to workers and even, believe it or not, consumers. Under the Constitution, he wasn't able to legislate directly to do this, so he tried to use the customs and excise powers of the Commonwealth. So he brought in two acts. One increased the existing tariffs, and then another act called the Excise Tariff Act introduced a matching new excise equal to the increase in tariffs on products manufactured in Australia, unless the manufacturer could prove that he paid fair and reasonable wages and reduced the price of his products to account for the amount that he was receiving in protection. Now, the legislation didn't define what fair and reasonable wages were, or have any means of supervising the companies actually reduce the price of their product. We're about to see a similar sort of fun and games with when we see the alleged benefits of abolishing the carbon tax and trying to say, has it actually come off the price of toothpaste to the appropriate degree? And the bureaucracy that's going to be needed to be set up to supervise this is going to be absolutely massive. And similarly, it would have in this, except that Deakin made no provision at all for it. He just left it to the courts. So the Commonwealth Conciliation and Arbitration Court had recently been set up, and Mackay applied to it for remission of excise on his products, believing he already paid fair and reasonable wages. Now, the president of the court, that's Alfred Deakin. I should have come to that. I always forget to move the slides along, but yes, that's Alfred Deakin, our brilliant but deranged Prime Minister. And that's Henry Higgins. Not to be confused with the Henry Higgins of My Fair Lady, but apparently when Pygmalion, the play that My Fair Lady was based on, came out, Higgins inquired whether the character Henry Higgins was in fact based on him. I don't believe it was the case, but anyway, he had a wonderful moustache. And he selected H.V. Mackay's case to be a test case to decide what fair and reasonable wages really were. So the case was held in October 1907, and George Shaw, H.V. Mackay's solicitor, got together to work up the case that the existing wages were fair and reasonable. And the Agricultural Implement Makers Union, which represented a few of Mackay's workers, most of whom were not union members, argued that wages were far too low. The union leaders, who were all socialists, instructed their barrister to seek wage justice on the basis of Mackay's huge profits, but Justice Higgins refused to accept this approach. He said the case wasn't about profit sharing, but about the payment of wages before profits were calculated. Higgins believed that any employer who could not pay fair and reasonable wages should not be in business. Higgins researched to find out, so he started researching to find out what the cost of living was, so as he could work out what fair and reasonable wages would be. Now, there were no accurate figures available at the time. The ABS hadn't started collecting much data on the cost of living, so the research was really amateurish. He got some figures from an article on working class life in Melbourne by a prominent socialist writer, and then he prompted the union involved in the case to produce the budgets of 11 supposedly random households to show how much it cost a family to live. Now, while the case was being heard, George Shaw wrote a letter to a friend, which fortunately has survived, and in the letter he wrote, "I've come to the conclusion that we are sure to have our wages put up," that we being Mackay's. "Between you and me, I would not be particularly sorry at the result if I were not battling for Mackay. I do not think he could support the wages he pays if he had all the KCs in the world. KC, of course, we had a king then, so it was KC, King's Council, as opposed to Queen's Council. Now, do you still have Queen's Council in West Australia, or do they call themselves Senior Council? Senior Council, yeah. Victoria has just gone back to QCs. So, and it's amazing that barristers were given an option where they could be SCs or QCs, and almost all of them have gone back to being QCs. So it's amazing that the ties of monarchy. But anyway, so all the KCs in the world couldn't argue the case for Mackay to pay the wages he did. It was what his solicitor thought, and his solicitor was right. Justice Higgins found the wages paid by Mackay to his unskilled workers were not fair and reasonable. So how did he define fair and reasonable? He took no account at all of market forces or business conditions in deciding the case. He thought that the Parliament, by the words fair and reasonable, must mean something more than the level set by what he described as the barbarous higgling of the market, which is what this conference is all about, I guess, the barbarous higgling of the market. Some more quotes from the judgment. I cannot think of any other standard than the normal needs of the average employee regarded as a human being living in a civilised community. Wages should be sufficient to provide proper food and water and such shelter and rest as workers need, and a condition of frugal comfort estimated by current human standards. So he tried to work out what that meant, and so using this small survey of household expenses that had been presented as evidence during the case, he guessed that the average household consisted of a husband, a wife and 3 children. In fact, he was quite a long way out with that. The average household was actually more like husband, wife and 2 children, so people were being paid for an extra child that they didn't have on average. But he ruled that the minimum living wage should be 7 shillings a week. So if you remember, H.V. Mackay was paying 6 shillings, so he had to increase his wages by 7 shillings a day. He had to increase his wages by a shilling a day. George Shaw was not surprised by this decision and privately welcomed it. But Mackay, obviously, was outraged, especially by the demand for £20,000, then an enormous amount of money, in excise. He demanded that his lawyer fix it. And so George Shaw decided the best option was to challenge the validity of the Excise Tariff Act. So they went off to the High Court. Always great fun for a solicitor going to the High Court. They love it. And the case was heard in March 1908. Mackay's barristers argued the Act was unconstitutional. The court agreed 3-2 and the Act was thrown out. So that you'd think might be the end of it, but the court's decision really just said that the Commonwealth had exceeded its powers in trying to regulate wages and conditions using its powers over customs and excise. But it said nothing about the principles that had guided Higgins in making his decision as to what was fair and reasonable. And Higgins, as president of the Conciliation and Arbitration Court, continued to use those principles. So the decision got Mackay off having to pay excise, but the principles were maintained by the court going into the future. And these principles, the principles of the Harvester judgment, became the foundation of the Australian industrial relations system for many decades. It took about 13 years for the award to percolate through the system, through all the various federal and state awards. But by the early 1920s, the basic wage was established as the minimum wage for an adult male to support himself and his family. And then there was an incredibly complicated system of margins for skilled physical labour and so on built on top of the basic wage. Another addition after the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it wasn't called that then, but what we know as the ABS began calculating the cost of living changes, the basic wage began to be tied to the cost of living, so in inflationary times it rose automatically every quarter. The Harvester judgment struck a very strong chord with public opinion in Australia. The concept that the state had a role in adjudicating wages wasn't new, because several states had wages from the 1880s. But what was new was the concept of a minimum wage based not on market forces or what employers could pay, but on calculations of what was needed to support a family. So why was the Harvester judgment adopted with such enthusiasm and supported by a majority of Australians for many decades? I think the fate of the Howard government's work choice policy gives some indication. The majority of the electorate always seems to believe that there should be more to industrial relations than what Justice Higgins described as the barbarous higgling of the market. I don't think it's coincidence the only 2 elections where the Prime Minister's lost his seat have been when the Conservative side of politics has attempted major reforms to the industrial relations system. In 1929, when Stanley Melbourne Bruce lost his seat, and 2007. So That all harks back, of course, to the earlier talks on democracy. That's why are the Australian people, why do they think that? I think the fact that H.V. Mackay's solicitor privately agreed with the Harvester decision goes a long way towards explaining its quick and widespread acceptance. Because it's not that George Shaw was some sort of wild lefty. He was extremely conservative in his politics. He always voted for the anti-Labor parties. He had a big house in Tarak, then is now Melbourne's most exclusive suburb. He was a member of the Royal Melbourne Golf Club and actually played, unlike most members of the Royal Melbourne Golf Club. He was a member of the Melbourne Club. Not that this means one is necessarily conservative. Our keynote speaker is a former president, so I wouldn't cast those sort of aspersions. But it does have a reputation for conservatism. And in fact, George Shaw died in his favourite armchair in the Melbourne Club in 1953. So why should such a man, and many more conservatives, support the establishment of a legal minimum wage based on the needs of workers and their families rather than leave wage setting to the operation of the market? I think the answer goes back to the depression of the 1890s and the industrial relations turmoil that accompanied it. We don't hear a great deal of the depression of the 1890s. The depression of the 1930s is still recent enough that it's in the memory, at least, of the grandparents of people who were there. For many of us, our parents, and some of us, possibly saw the end of it. But the depression of the 1890s has largely been forgotten. It was an enormous shock, far more of a shock than the depression of the 1930s, which you could see coming a mile off, that things were going to get tough. The 1920s, just things got worse and worse the last few years, and with the First World War, they'd been used to negative economic shocks. But the depression of the 1890s came after the last real depression in Australia being the 1840s, so 50 years before. Hardly anyone alive would have remembered it. There'd been sustained economic growth ever since the discovery of gold. Australia had the highest per capita income in the world, high wages, shortage of labour, close to zero unemployment. And then in the 1880s, things seemed to get even better. The high export prices, the discovery of rich new mines at Mount Morgan and Broken Hill, rising capital inflow from Britain. There was an economic boom across all of Australia. In Melbourne, the boom just turned into one of the most amazing bubbles in history, rivaled the South Sea bubble or the tulip mania in Holland. In 1887, 1888, prices for city and suburban land doubled, trebled, quadrupled in a matter of months. Share prices just went through the roof. And all these paper millionaires were building mansions all over the place. Land was subdivided for suburban lots around Melbourne that so far from the CBD, they've only been built on in the last 20 years. Just quite extraordinary. You look at a subdivision for places sort of way out past Point Cook, you see they were subdivided in 1888 and then just left empty until very recently. I think one of the very few rules that young economists need to learn is that every boom is followed by a bust. And never ever believe people who say, this time it's different. And I was delighted speaking to Greg Moore yesterday that he teaches a course on booms and busts, which hopefully is getting that message through to all his students. I think the course should be compulsory. Anyway, following the boom of the 1880s, the bust of the early 1890s was of absolutely epic proportions. Every economic trend which had made the 1880s a good decade went into reverse. Export prices fell, capital inflow dried up, the mining boom faded, confidence fell. Sounds worryingly familiar, doesn't it? The collapse built up momentum as property prices plummeted, businesses failed. In April 1893, many of the trading banks closed their doors. The loss or locking up of depositors and shareholders' funds dramatically reduced the volume of money circulating in the economy. There was rapid and sustained deflation for several years. We've seen a little touch of deflation in Japan in recent years, and it's not a pretty sight. And in Australia in the 1890s, it was far worse. Australia's GDP fell by at least 14% between 1891 and 1895. As those who've worked with Noel Button will know, these figures on Australia's GDP are the subject of great controversy, but there's no doubt they fell very sharply. In Victoria, the fall was even greater. The only colony to escape the depression was Western Australia. Because of the discovery of gold, Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie, and tens of thousands of people fled Melbourne and headed west. The population of Melbourne fell from 486,000 in 1891 to 417,000 in 1901, and whole houses of streets that had been built in the boom stood empty. Unemployment figures for the 1890s are no more than a guess, but I think in Victoria it would have been over 25%. And as the economy collapsed, there was a massive wave of industrial unrest all around Australia as workers tried to maintain their wages and employment. And at the same time, employers were trying to force down wages to keep their businesses afloat. So the Great Shearers' Strike, the Maritime Strike, and there were strikes and lockouts in almost every major industry. Because of the high unemployment, the strikes failed. Scab labour was very easy to find when men were starving. Unions were defeated, wages were cut, and hard-won conditions removed. Out of the ashes of the defeat rose the Labor Party. And one of its main policies from the start was centralised conciliation and arbitration. But it could not have brought it in without the support from the conservative side of politics. It's been common over these last 50 years to recognise the impact of the depression of the 1930s on those who grew up in that decade. People who grew up in hardship were thrifty, hard-working, looking for secure, lifelong employment. I mean, how many of you younger folk here have grandparents who still collect string or paper bags or margarine containers and things like that? I mean, my mother, who grew up in the Depression, when she goes to God, we will be throwing out hundreds of margarine containers because she saves them. And I think it's a very common thing for those who grew up in the Depression. The impact of the Depression of the 1890s was as great or even greater because the economic collapse was equally severe. In contrast to the 1930s, it was accompanied by massive and violent strikes and lockouts. So I don't think it's surprising that those who lived through this industrial chaos were keen to explore alternative ways of resolving industrial disputes. George Shaw himself often talked of the turmoil of 1890 when shearers, sailors, miners and other key groups of workers were all on strike or locked out, and enormous demonstrations were taking place in central Melbourne. He lived through this period and this had a very strong impact on him and left him very open to new approaches to industrial relations. And this was very general throughout Australia and in New Zealand, and so several of the colonies and New Zealand set up various forms of conciliation or arbitration. And coincidentally, soon after they were established, prices stopped falling and economic conditions began to improve. And people thought, it's because of conciliation and arbitration. The fact is it was probably mainly due to the gold discoveries in West Australia, South Africa and Alaska. But at the time, it seemed coincidental that we bring in conciliation and arbitration and things get better. So the first side of it didn't seem to do too much damage. At a wider level, the crash seemed to demonstrate the failure of the free market. And consequently it encouraged the spread of socialism and state intervention in the economy. It's important to remember, I think, that socialism was not yet damned by the failure of communism, and it attracted increasing support among workers and intellectuals. But even many of those who remained wedded to capitalism supported the extension of state ownership of such things as transport systems, electricity generation, and even in Queensland a chain of butchers' shops. So what was called state socialism was very, very strong in Australia in the decade or 2 decades before the First World War. So when the Commonwealth was established in 1901, the major issues facing it, or the contemporaries saw the major issues facing it, is how to minimise class conflict and maintain Australia as a high-wage economy. And the result was, as we've discussed endlessly today, the Deaconite settlement. To repeat it again, the main elements, White Australia policy, which, as one of the earlier speakers commented, wasn't brought in just because Australians were racist, although no doubt many were, but to limit competition for jobs from low-wage immigrants. The centralised conciliation and arbitration system with a high minimum wage, the Harvester decision was central to this, and high tariffs to maintain profits and enable employers to pay high wages. Now, okay, I'll just be a minute. So it's a very simple exercise in economics to point out the cost of the system in higher prices. And I'm not going to argue with the economics, but the economics doesn't necessarily show how to account for the possible benefits of the Deaconite system in terms of such things as social cohesion, a moderation of class conflict and industrial disputes, a more egalitarian society and a more diverse economy. Now, these are getting to be things that are very difficult to debate using economist tools. The economic costs of the Deaconite settlement weren't ignored in the first half of the 20th century, clearly pointed out by Edward Shan, who's been discussed today, and his book is well worth reading for a critique of the Harvester judgment. But the fact is the majority of Australians stayed wedded to Deakin's principles until the 1960s. And I think I might end it there, because what I was going to end it on would have upset way too many people for me to end it on that note.
When you talk about White Australia and the introduction of White Australia, of course, Bruce Smith voted against White Australia. The one genuine free trade, laissez-faire economist, was never given office after his, I think he was treasurer, ended up as treasurer on parks in New South Wales. They never trusted him with office. All the years he was in Canberra. But the thing is, you see, that's a particular story about the 1890s. There's another story about the 1890s, and that's the election of the Reid government in New South Wales in 1894, who did two crucial things. They basically abolished all tariffs and introduced income tax. Now, Shan himself admits that economic recovery in New South Wales was much faster and better than in the other states. Now, the existence of the Reidites and the Free Traders indicates that that wasn't the only reaction. There was still a strong, if you actually look at voting figures and so on, the Deaconites are only a little bit ahead of the Free Traders. So there was another road that was taken, but which perhaps at a federal level didn't quite have the numbers to be taken. And as I mentioned in my paper this morning, the election of Joseph Cook as the successor to Deakin was perhaps an indication that if things hadn't quite gone wrong in 1914, there could have been a more liberal approach at the federal level as well. So it's a contested, I think it's a contested...
Yeah, look, I agree. There's no doubt that it's contested, and the New South Wales case very clearly shows it another way. I think my analysis certainly was Victorian focused, both because all the events took place in Victoria, and the depression of the 1890s was far worse in Victoria than any other spot. And Victoria, of course, been protectionists for many decades before that, and I don't think there was a free trader elected to the Victorian Parliament after the 1870s. I'm not sure of that, but I can't think of one.
In many ways, this whole Deaconite thing is a victory, if I may put it this way, of Victoria over New South Wales. It's one way of constructing it. The next question is to say why. New South Wales
and Queensland.
Okay. There's a question over there.
Yeah, my name is Carson. Just a question regarding H.B. McCabe Mann. Would he be the equivalent of Henry Ford for Australia, or are there other businessmen like him?
Look, there certainly were others. In terms of starting an industry from scratch and building it up, I can't think of any others who did it. I think that's certainly very much the Henry Ford model. Most great entrepreneurs, great businessmen, make their fortunes in one business, and McKay was certainly like that. The other name that sprang immediately to my mind, having just written a biography of him, was W.L. Baillieu. But he made his fortune in about 10 or 12 different industries. I mean, he was a co-founder of Rio Tinto, the Herald and Weekly Times, Carlton United Brewery, the ANZ Bank, Pacific Dunlop. I could go on for a long time, but he was quite a freak. Whereas H.V. McKay was very much, as you say, in the Henry Ford mould.
If I can underline the parallel, Henry Ford, of course, is famous for paying higher wages to his workers for his own self-interest. And so, as Peter pointed out, was Henry Higgins paying above average wages. Indeed, he was a progressive employer. He built sort of tennis courts and gardens and pleasure palaces and what have you for his workers for his own reason, right? To keep them happy and contented, or at least to try to, without success. But yeah, he was a progressive employer. Realised. Yes.
Oh, just a quick one. My own family background is very linked closely to the company that became. About 3 or 4 of my aunts and uncles worked for them. My mother worked for them, and we lived in the sunshine when I grew up. I'm just wondering if you can elucidate a little bit on what happened to that company later. I mean, clearly its demise arose with the tariff reductions and so forth. Prior to that, though, it was acquired by the Canadians.
Yeah, yes. Yes. So in 1926, H.V. Mackay died in 1924, I think it was, after having bought himself an enormous mansion on the edge of Melbourne, and he died soon afterwards. And the business soon afterwards, I think it was a merger rather than a takeover with Massey Harris of Canada, and they kept the Sunshine factory going and also built a big new factory in Geelong and did very well until the 1960s, 1970s, when one narrative of this would be that John Hyde came along and wrecked their business. But the other narrative, of course, would be that after decades of protection, they'd become massively inefficient, and as soon as there was, tariffs were low a little bit, they collapsed. So, like so many other Australian manufacturers, once tariffs were lowered, it just revealed how hopelessly inefficient they'd become. So, and the factory, the great factory that you saw in the picture there, was demolished in the 1980s, most of it.
I'm trying to interject myself, but another issue about whatever happened to the Harvester Company, come back to Henry Ford, is that it didn't go into developing vehicles, right, for household use. And there is a mystery about the whole Australian economy in the period before the 1920s, is that even though we had a high-income population, right, very widely dispersed, the car did not get off the ground. Okay, it remained just an imported luxury. So I just there's just a question there for economic historians as to why, for example, he mightn't have got into producing
Yes,
cars.
there's a paper going to come out fairly soon in something on the First World War by one William Coleman, which I understand discusses that issue. So I won't try discussing it now.
Yes, other questions? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, it just simply remains to thank Peter for his fascinating. We have a break and then we come back for our capstone lecture.